It was a Sunday morning in St. Mary Mead, a sleepy village nestled in the heart of the English countryside. The sun was shining through a curtain of mist, casting a soft golden glow over the green fields and stone cottages. The villagers were going about their daily routines, many on their way to the small, ivy-clad church on the corner of the village square. The air was crisp, the scent of freshly baked bread wafting from Mrs. Wainwright's bakery, mingling with the faint smell of the earth, as though the village itself was holding its breath. The peaceful atmosphere of St. Mary Mead was one that many took for granted. Life here moved slowly, almost imperceptibly, and nothing much ever happened to disturb its tranquility. But in every quiet village, behind every polite conversation, there were hidden stories, unspoken secrets, and lives tinged with bitterness or desire. And it was within this hidden web of human nature that the seeds of a most unsettling mystery would soon be sown. Miss Jane Marple sat in her little cottage on the edge of the village, sipping her tea and watching the world go by through the lace curtains of her sitting room. She was a woman of advancing years, her face lined with time, but her eyes, sharp, observant, and full of quiet wisdom, could not be mistaken for someone who had simply aged into her surroundings. Miss Marple had long ago learned that the most extraordinary events often occurred beneath the most ordinary facades, and it was this quiet intuition that made her the village's most trusted, albeit unassuming, detective. The events that would soon transpire began at the local fete. It was the kind of gathering that St. Mary Mead was famous for, an afternoon of games, cakes, and cheerful conversation. The village ladies, in their best dresses, stood gossiping by the stalls, while the gentlemen tried their hand at the coconut shy. Children ran laughing through the grass, their faces smeared with jam and chocolate. At the center of it all stood the towering oak tree, its wide branches offering shelter from the sun. Among the crowd, however, was one person who was not there to enjoy the day. Edward Farlow, a wealthy but reclusive art dealer, had come to St. Mary Mead only a month ago, bringing with him an air of mystery and a collection of rare paintings. Mr. Farlow had moved into the grand yet slightly faded manor house on the hill, just outside the village. The house was old, its windows rattling in the wind, and the garden overgrown with ivy. But it was the kind of place that spoke of bygone grandeur, a perfect setting for a man of Mr. Farlow's peculiar tastes. That Sunday afternoon, Mr. Farlow had invited several of the villagers to view an important new acquisition of his, a painting, he claimed, of great value and historical significance. It was, he said, a portrait of a long-lost noblewoman, painted by an artist whose work had been overshadowed by time. The unveiling of the portrait at the fete had been much anticipated, with the entire village abuzz with curiosity. Miss Marple had been invited, of course, though she had no great interest in art or paintings. It was simply the polite thing to do in a village where everyone knew everyone else's business. And, as Miss Marple well knew, it was often in the smallest gestures, the quietest conversations, where secrets began to unravel. It was just as the guests had gathered around the easel, eager to catch their first glimpse of the mysterious portrait, that the first sign of trouble occurred. The painting, covered with a large cloth, had been revealed to a collective gasp of awe and admiration. The noblewoman's face, painted in soft, muted tones, seemed almost lifelike. But as the crowd gathered closer to inspect the details, something struck them all, something unsettling. The portrait, it seemed, was not what it appeared to be. A small detail, almost imperceptible, caught Miss Marple's eye. The woman in the painting, though elegant and poised, wore an expression of sadness, her eyes oddly distant, as though she were staring into a world beyond the frame. It was a detail that many of the guests missed, distracted by the grandeur of the piece itself, but Miss Marple was not one to overlook such subtleties. Before she could consider the matter further, a scream broke the quiet air of the fete. It was sharp, chilling, and filled with unmistakable fear. Miss Marple's eyes darted to the source of the sound, where a young woman, pale and trembling, was pointing at the portrait. The woman's voice shook as she spoke. "Mr. Farlow, the painting, there's something wrong with the painting." Edward Farlow, who had been standing proudly beside the portrait, turned to her with a look of confusion. "What are you saying? There is nothing wrong with it." But the woman was insistent. "Look there. The woman in the painting. She's moving. She's not still." The crowd, now murmuring and uneasy, began to crowd around the easel. Miss Marple, though, took a step back, observing. The woman in the portrait remained perfectly still, her painted eyes fixed in an eternal gaze. It was absurd, of course, to think that the painting was anything more than a mere likeness. Yet, something about the situation did not sit right. It was at that moment, just as the atmosphere in the room grew tense and confused, that Edward Farlow collapsed. He fell to the ground with a dull thud, his face turning ashen. Panic spread through the crowd like wildfire, and within moments, the police were called. The fate was quickly brought to a halt, the jovial atmosphere evaporating in the wake of Mr. Farlow's sudden collapse. The villagers whispered in hushed tones, and soon, the inevitable question arose. Had it been a natural death, or had Mr. Farlow been murdered? The police arrived swiftly, led by Inspector Cray, a seasoned officer with little patience for the theatrics of small-town life. After a cursory examination of the scene, Cray declared the cause of death to be a heart attack, a condition to which Mr. Farlow had allegedly been prone. But Miss Marple, ever the astute observer, was not convinced. Her mind, always sharp and calculating, began to turn over the small details of the day, the strange unease she had felt when first gazing at the portrait, the abruptness of Farlow's collapse, and the odd behavior of some of the guests. As the crowd began to disperse, Miss Marple made her way home, her mind already racing. She had learned long ago that appearances could be deceiving, and she was certain that there was more to Mr. Farlow's sudden death than the police cared to admit. That night, as she sat by the fire in her cozy cottage, Miss Marple reflected on the events of the day. The portrait, she thought, held the key to understanding what had truly happened at the fete. But what was the connection between the painting and Mr. Farlow's untimely demise? What hidden secrets had been revealed under the gaze of that painted woman? The answers, Miss Marple knew, would not come easily. But she was confident that with time, patience, and a careful study of the facts, she would uncover the truth, no matter how dark or unsettling it might be. The morning following the strange events at Mr. Farlow's unveiling was one of those bright, crisp days that seemed to reflect the optimism of the village itself. The clouds had parted to reveal a brilliant blue sky, and the sunlight gleamed off the freshly dewed grass as Miss Marple made her way to the village square. She walked slowly, as was her wont, her gait unhurried but purposeful, her mind far from the serene beauty around her. At the church, the bells were ringing, calling the villagers to the Sunday service, but Miss Marple's thoughts were far removed from the hymns and prayers that would soon fill the air. Instead, she found herself lost in the puzzle that had so abruptly emerged the previous afternoon. Edward Farlow's death, the portrait, the woman's cry, and his sudden collapse, nothing about the situation seemed quite right. She had listened to the whispers of the villagers, many of whom had been quick to offer their own theories. Some claimed that Mr. Farlow had been stricken by the sheer excitement of revealing such a prized acquisition. Others murmured that the portrait, with its sorrowful eyes, had somehow bewitched him. Most, however, were content to believe the simple explanation that Farlow's death had been due to natural causes. He had not been a young man, after all, and heart attacks, as the inspector had noted, were all too common. But Miss Marple had learned long ago to look beyond the obvious. There was more to this than met the eye. As the morning wore on, Miss Marple visited the manor house, where Mr. Farlow had lived for the past month. The house, though grand in its own way, bore the signs of age and neglect. Ivy crawled up the stone walls, and the windows, though large and once elegant, were now slightly askew, as though time itself had started to claim its territory. Miss Marple was shown into the drawing-room, a large, airy space with high ceilings and windows that overlooked the garden. The room was full of Farlow's collection, paintings lining the walls in careful order. But it was the portrait, the one that had caused such a stir, that Miss Marple's eyes gravitated toward immediately. It stood in the center of the room, still on the easel where it had been unveiled the day before. The cloth had been removed, leaving the painted woman to gaze silently at all who entered. Miss Marple approached it slowly, her keen eyes inspecting every inch. The woman in the portrait was indeed beautiful, delicate features, a high forehead, and a sadness about her that made Miss Marple's heart ache. But it wasn't the portrait itself that captured her attention. It was the strange sense of familiarity, the subtle oddness that she could not place. "Miss Marple," came a voice from the door. It was Mrs. Heatherstone, the housekeeper, a woman of middle years with a nervous disposition. "I do hope you don't mind my disturbing you, but the inspector is here." Miss Marple nodded politely, though she could feel her pulse quicken. It was clear that the investigation was beginning in earnest, and with it, the clock was ticking. Inspector Cray, a tall, stolid man with a permanent frown etched on his face, entered the room with a brisk step. He regarded Miss Marple with a mixture of curiosity and polite indifference. He had little respect for the village's amateur sleuth, though he could not deny her uncanny ability to notice things that others did not. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said in a clipped tone, "I trust you're not too disappointed that the excitement of the fete has already been overshadowed by this unfortunate tragedy." "Tragedy, indeed," Miss Marple replied softly, her gaze still fixed on the portrait. "But I do wonder, Inspector, if there's more to it than meets the eye." Cray raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by her musings. "You have your own thoughts, I suppose. I would like to hear them, if only for my own amusement." Miss Marple smiled quietly, a faint twinkle in her eye. "Not just for amusement, Inspector. You see, there is something about this portrait. Something that doesn't sit right." "Something doesn't sit right?" Cray scoffed. "It's simply a painting of a long-dead woman. Farlow was hardly in the best of health, and we've already established that he was prone to heart problems. His death was natural. No need to make more of it than that." Miss Marple nodded slowly, as if conceding the point, but her mind was already piecing together a much more complex puzzle. Yes, of course. But I do wonder, Inspector, how many times a perfectly natural death occurs at the same time as a dramatic event, like, for example, the unveiling of a prized portrait." Cray paused, caught off guard by the question. "What are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" "I'm suggesting that Mr. Farlow's death may not have been entirely due to natural causes," Miss Marple said calmly. "You see, there is a curious pattern to his behavior before he died. Something about his reaction, his sudden collapse, struck me as hurried, almost as though he were trying to hide something." The inspector was silent for a moment, clearly weighing her words. Finally he spoke, his voice less certain than before. "You're suggesting foul play? That seems rather far-fetched." Miss Marple's eyes never left the painting. "I'm not suggesting anything, Inspector. But I do believe that this portrait, as unusual as it seems, holds a clue. Perhaps not about the death itself, but about its cause." Cray's face hardened. "Miss Marple, I appreciate your interest, but the matter is already settled. We've got the cause of death, and we're looking into his background. There's no reason to suspect anything else." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I do believe that we may need to look just a little closer, Inspector. If you will permit me, of course." With that, the inspector left the room, his skepticism clearly etched on his face. But Miss Marple had no intention of being deterred. As she stood before the portrait once more, she studied the woman's face, the eyes, so distant and sad, yet holding something deeper, something more. She wondered, as she often did, how many lives had been affected by this painting, how many secrets had been hidden behind its solemn expression. There was a story here, she was certain of it, one that had yet to be told. The days following Edward Farlow's sudden death passed in the usual manner for St. Mary Mead. The villagers, ever eager to gossip, speculated endlessly over the cause of his demise. But as the police had already closed the matter with their assessment of natural causes, the mystery seemed to dissipate like the morning mist. For most, the affair was as quickly forgotten as the discarded programs from the fete, and life resumed its slow, rhythmic pace. Yet, Miss Marple's curiosity remained unquenched. Each time she passed the small corner shop where Farlow's paintings had once been displayed, she found herself staring at the poster advertising an exhibition of rare and historical portraits. It was as though the very face of the woman in the portrait that had caused such a stir at the fete was watching her, pressing her to uncover what lay beneath the surface. The manner in which Edward Farlow had collapsed, his expression of surprise or perhaps recognition, lingered in Miss Marple's thoughts. The more she pondered it, the more certain she became that there was something more to the mystery, something that no one had yet noticed. She could not escape the sensation that the portrait, now framed in Farlow's sitting room, was not merely the cause of his death, but a clue that would lead her to the truth. It was on a quiet Tuesday afternoon that she received an unexpected visitor. The knock on her door was soft yet firm, and Miss Marple, who had been in the middle of her knitting, set her work aside with a quick motion. She had learned long ago that visitors, particularly those with no obvious cause, often held keys to untold mysteries. She opened the door to find a tall, middle-aged man standing on her doorstep. His face, stern and unsmiling, looked vaguely familiar. Miss Marple's sharp eyes assessed him in a flash. He had a slight air of discomfort, as though he were unused to polite society. His gray suit was impeccably tailored, his black hat in hand, and he appeared every bit the professional. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," he said, his voice calm yet authoritative. "I am Arthur Ellsworth, solicitor for the late Mr. Farlow. I was instructed to find you by the family of the late gentleman." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow but gestured for him to enter. "Please do come in, Mr. Ellsworth. You are very kind to visit me. Would you care for some tea?" He accepted with a nod, and as Miss Marple busied herself with the kettle, she could not help but feel the curiosity rising inside her. A solicitor sent by Mr. Farlow's family. How intriguing. Farlow had not been known to have any close relations, as far as Miss Marple was aware. She recalled that during the unveiling of the portrait, the art dealer had not spoken of any family, and he had seemed very much a man alone. When the tea was ready, they sat by the fire, the warmth of the room a contrast to the cold, slightly tense atmosphere between them. Miss Marple observed Ellsworth carefully, noting his discomfort. He had the air of a man on the verge of revealing something important, yet he hesitated. After a long moment of silence, he finally spoke. "I'm afraid I must be forthright with you, Miss Marple. Mr. Farlow's sudden death has not been as easily explained as Inspector Cray would have liked to believe. His family, whom I represent, has reason to suspect foul play." Miss Marple did not flinch. She set her teacup down gently. "Foul play, you say? But surely the inspector has ruled out anything more than natural causes." Ellsworth nodded, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "Yes, the inspector believes it to be a heart attack. But there are circumstances surrounding Mr. Farlow's life that suggest otherwise." He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "Mr. Farlow was in the process of selling several pieces from his collection, including the very portrait that caused such a stir at the fete. It is rather valuable, I understand." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her mind already working. A portrait of such value. Why had Farlow been so eager to sell it? And who had he intended to sell it to? "Go on, Mr. Ellsworth," she urged gently, her voice calm yet expectant. Mr. Farlow had been in correspondence with several prominent collectors in Europe, and one in particular, a gentleman named Gregory Knight, had expressed great interest in the portrait of the noblewoman. The last letter I received from Mr. Farlow, dated just days before his death, mentioned that a transaction was imminent. The letter was somewhat vague, but it mentioned something unsettling about the portrait, a connection, perhaps, to Mr. Farlow's own past. His past? Miss Marple repeated, intrigued. What could this connection be? Ellsworth hesitated again, the tension in his posture evident. "That's the thing, Miss Marple. I don't know." But Farlow's letter indicated that the portrait was tied to some unresolved matters from his youth, and that these matters had something to do with the noblewoman in the painting. Miss Marple considered this. It was, as she had suspected, no mere coincidence that Farlow had been struck down just after revealing the painting. But who would have had a motive to harm him? And what was the secret that lay behind the woman's mournful eyes? "Mr. Ellsworth, would it be possible for you to show me this letter?" she asked. "Perhaps there is something in it that will provide the key to this puzzle." Ellsworth seemed momentarily taken aback. I'm afraid I cannot. The letter is now in the possession of the police. But what I can do, Miss Marple, is give you a brief outline of what Mr. Farlow said in his final correspondence. He made it clear that the portrait was not simply a work of art, it was a relic of some tragic incident in his own history. He mentioned a family secret, something that had long been buried. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, her mind swirling with the implications. A family secret, buried for years. Was the portrait merely a symbol, or was it something more? Had Mr. Farlow's death been part of a larger, more deliberate plan, one rooted in long-forgotten grievances and untold betrayals? "Thank you, Mr. Ellsworth," Miss Marple said softly. "You've given me much to consider. I shall look into this matter further, but I have a feeling that the portrait will be the key to unraveling it all." The solicitor nodded, though he did not seem entirely convinced. "I hope you are right, Miss Marple. But be careful, there are more dangerous forces at play here than you may realize." With that, he took his leave, leaving Miss Marple alone with her thoughts. She watched him walk down the lane, his figure fading into the distance. As the door closed behind him, Miss Marple's mind was already at work. A family secret, a portrait, and a death that did not seem entirely natural. There was no doubt in her mind that she was on the trail of something far deeper than anyone had yet realized. The puzzle was growing more complex with each passing moment, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that nothing was too complicated for her little gray cells. And so, with renewed purpose, she set about her investigation, certain that the answer lay hidden in the layers of the past, and in the painted eyes of the woman on the canvas. Miss Marple was not one to rush into matters. She believed that the answers to life's greatest mysteries were often revealed through careful observation, gentle inquiry, and the patience to let time unearth the truth. And so, she began her investigation into Edward Farlow's death in the way that she knew best, quietly and unobtrusively. Her first course of action was to visit the police station and speak with Inspector Cray. She had, of course, been at the fete the previous Sunday, and had witnessed the events surrounding Farlow's sudden death. She was sure that the inspector would be more than willing to answer any questions she might have. The constable at the desk greeted her politely and led her into the small office where Inspector Cray was reviewing some papers. He looked up with a raised eyebrow as Miss Marple entered, her demeanor as calm and composed as ever. He gestured for her to sit. "Miss Marple," Cray said, his tone neutral but not unkind, "I trust you're not here to trouble me with more wild theories about Mr. Farlow's death." Miss Marple smiled faintly, adjusting her shawl as she sat down. "Wild theories, Inspector? I would hardly call them wild. Merely observations." Cray sighed, running a hand over his face. "I've had enough of observations for the time being. As far as I'm concerned, this case is closed. Farlow died of natural causes, heart attack, as we confirmed." "I understand," Miss Marple said gently, "but there are a few details, I believe, that have not yet been fully examined." Cray's eyes narrowed, his expression becoming more guarded. "And what details would those be, Miss Marple?" "I've been considering the portrait," she said, her voice calm and measured. "The one Mr. Farlow revealed at the fete. There is something about it that does not sit well with me." Cray shook his head dismissively. "I've already been told about that. Some of the guests had fancied the portrait was alive, whatever that means. But that's nonsense, Miss Marple. There's nothing more to it." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with quiet persistence. "Ah, but you see, Inspector, I don't believe it was the portrait that caused Mr. Farlow's death. I believe it was the secrets behind it. What if Mr. Farlow's death was not a coincidence, but a result of something he knew? Something tied to that very portrait?" Cray leaned back in his chair, clearly irritated. "And you think someone killed him because of an old painting?" Miss Marple did not flinch. "I think there is more to this painting than you realize. I've learned, over the years, that things are rarely as simple as they appear. Sometimes, Inspector, the smallest details, something as simple as a painting, can be the key to understanding a much larger puzzle." Cray looked at her for a long moment, his brow furrowed. Finally, he sighed. "You've got your own way of seeing things, Miss Marple. I'll give you that. But I'm not about to reopen a case that's already been settled." "Of course not, Inspector," Miss Marple said softly. "I merely thought I'd ask. For my own peace of mind." There was a moment of silence between them, but Cray remained resolute. "I'll let you know if anything new comes up. But I'm telling you, Miss Marple, this is a dead end." Miss Marple rose from her seat, her movements slow and deliberate. She gave Cray a small smile, though her eyes were thoughtful. "Very well, Inspector. But I shall continue my inquiries in my own way, as I am sure you understand." With that, she left the station, the door closing quietly behind her. The inspector's dismissive tone still lingered in her ears, but Miss Marple did not let it deter her. She knew, as she always had, that the key to any mystery lay not in what one was told, but in what was left unsaid. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to the local inn, where some of the guests from the fete had stayed. The inn was small but well kept, with a cozy, intimate atmosphere. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the smell of roasting meat filled the air. She made her way to the back room, where a few of the village's more talkative residents were having tea. Sitting at one of the tables, she found herself beside Mrs. Wainwright, the baker's wife, who was more than happy to recount every detail of the fate. "I do think it was dreadful, Miss Marple," Mrs. Wainwright said, shaking her head, her glasses perched precariously on the end of her nose. "That poor Mr. Farlow, such a pleasant man too. I never would have guessed it was going to happen like that." "Do you know, Mrs. Wainwright," Miss Marple said gently, "I've been thinking about the portrait, the one Mr. Farlow revealed. You were standing close to the easel, were you not?" Yes, I was," Mrs. Wainwright replied, her eyes darting to the side, as though she were recalling something. "And I saw it, plain as day. It was a lovely thing, really. Beautifully painted, though. Well, there was something strange about it, don't you think?" "Strange?" Miss Marple asked, leaning in slightly. Mrs. Wainwright's face grew serious. "I'm not sure how to explain it, but there was something about her eyes. The woman in the portrait, I mean. She didn't seem to be looking at anyone, but at something far away. Almost like she was watching something else, something we couldn't see." "Interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "What do you think it means?" "I don't know," Mrs. Wainwright said, lowering her voice. "But I heard Mr. Farlow say something just before he collapsed. He said, 'It's too late now,' and then he went down like a stone." Miss Marple's brow furrowed. "Too late for what?" "I don't know," Mrs. Wainwright replied, shaking her head. "But it was an odd thing to say, wasn't it? Just before he fell." Miss Marple's mind raced. The woman in the portrait, the cryptic words, and Farlow's sudden collapse. It was all beginning to take shape in her mind, though the puzzle was far from complete. "I shall certainly keep that in mind," Miss Marple said, standing up. "Thank you, Mrs. Wainwright, for your time. It's always the smallest things, you know, that help to untangle the most intricate of mysteries." Mrs. Wainwright nodded, but Miss Marple could see that her mind was elsewhere. There was much more to this than a simple heart attack, of that Miss Marple was certain. As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple made her way back to her cottage, her thoughts swirling. She had gathered a few fragments of the puzzle, but she knew there was much more to uncover. There were still unanswered questions. What had Mr. Farlow meant by his final words? And what was the true significance of the portrait? She could not help but feel that the answers were just within reach, waiting to be discovered. She would need to proceed with caution, for the people involved in this mystery were more than capable of concealing their secrets. But Miss Marple was patient, and she knew that in time, the truth would emerge. It always did. The next few days in St. Mary Mead were marked by an unnerving stillness. The air seemed heavy with unspoken words, and the village, though outwardly the same, hummed with a subtle tension that Miss Marple could sense, though few others seemed to. It had been nearly a week since Edward Farlow's sudden death, and yet the question of whether it was truly a natural one remained in the minds of those who had witnessed the events of the fete. The inspector had insisted that all was in order, that no foul play had occurred, but Miss Marple knew better. There was always more to a case than met the eye, and the details that seemed insignificant to others held the key to unraveling the mystery. She had learned, through careful conversation and observation, that many of the villagers had their own theories about Mr. Farlow's death, most of them simplistic but revealing. Some thought it had been a stroke, another believed that Farlow had been poisoned, and a few even entertained the fanciful notion that the portrait had some supernatural effect on him. These ideas, while entertaining in their absurdity, were nothing more than distractions. Red herrings, as Miss Marple had long known, were often the first things people latched onto when they couldn't see the truth. Miss Marple spent the following days quietly observing the village. She attended the weekly market, made polite small talk with the shopkeepers, and, in her own way, kept an eye on the activities at Mr. Farlow's manor. The house, which had been shuttered since his death, remained unchanged, an imposing silhouette against the backdrop of the countryside. It was during one of her visits to the market that she first encountered the woman who would turn out to be the most fascinating of all the potential suspects. Margaret Gillett, a striking woman in her late 30s with an air of aloofness that was both attractive and disconcerting. Miss Marple had seen her only once or twice before, but today she found herself observing her with renewed interest. Margaret, dressed in a dark green velvet gown that was slightly too extravagant for a simple market visit, stood by the butcher's stall, speaking to Mrs. Calloway, the local florist. From the way the two women leaned in toward one another, speaking in hushed tones, it was clear that Margaret was privy to something that the rest of the village was not. Miss Marple, though always circumspect in her approach, made her way over to the stall with a purposeful air. As she drew nearer, she couldn't help but overhear part of their conversation. "So much money, all for nothing," Margaret was saying, her voice low and filled with an almost bitter edge. "Do you think he would have sold it, Mrs. Calloway? That portrait?" Mrs. Calloway, a mild-mannered woman in her 50s, looked around nervously. "I don't know, Miss Gillett, but it seems a terrible shame that it ended like this." "Yes," Margaret's voice dropped even lower, "and I don't think the police understand the full extent of things. There are many who would do anything to possess that portrait. It's not just about money, it's about something much darker." Miss Marple, who had been standing nearby pretending to inspect the fresh vegetables, now allowed herself the slightest glance toward the women. Margaret Gillett's words sent a ripple of unease through her. The portrait was more than just an object of art. It was something powerful, something tied to Farlow's own past, and perhaps even to his death. But what could this darker meaning be? Miss Marple's curiosity had been piqued, and she knew that Margaret Gillett was not a woman to be taken lightly. There was something about her that made Miss Marple uneasy, an aura of secrecy that hinted at hidden motives. After Margaret left the market, Miss Marple decided to follow her from a distance, keeping just far enough behind to remain unobtrusive. Margaret made her way to the manor house, her steps purposeful. Miss Marple's keen eyes noted that she did not stop at the front door, but instead moved toward the side of the house, where a narrow path led through the garden to a back entrance. It was not long before Miss Marple reached the end of the street, where she paused behind a hedgerow to observe. There, hidden in the shadows, Margaret Gillett was speaking to someone just inside the gate. Miss Marple couldn't make out the words, but the body language was unmistakable. There was an exchange, a handoff, a secret transaction taking place. What was it? A letter? A key? Miss Marple watched in silence, her heart beating a little faster as she began to make sense of the puzzle. Margaret Gillett was clearly involved with Mr. Farlow's affairs, but how? And what role did the portrait play in it all? As the conversation ended, Margaret turned quickly and began walking away, but not toward the village. Instead, she veered off down a winding path leading toward the woods, her figure soon lost among the trees. Miss Marple knew that the time had come to act. She could no longer simply observe from the sidelines. There were too many unanswered questions, too many pieces to the puzzle that needed fitting together. The next morning, she paid a visit to Mr. Farlow's manor. She had a feeling that there were answers waiting for her inside, answers that would reveal the true nature of his death, and perhaps even the deeper mystery behind the portrait. She was not sure yet what she would find, but she had learned long ago to trust her instincts. And her instincts told her that the answers lay within the very walls of that old house. When Miss Marple arrived at the manor, she was greeted by the housekeeper, a quiet, unassuming woman named Mrs. Gibbons. "Good morning, Mrs. Gibbons," Miss Marple said politely. "I do hope I am not disturbing you. I simply wanted to take a quick look around, just to see how things are faring since Mr. Farlow's passing." "Oh no, Miss Marple, not at all," Mrs. Gibbons replied, her voice heavy with sorrow. "I've been here for many years now. It's strange, you know, not having Mr. Farlow around. But if you'd like to take a look about the house, I'll be glad to show you." Miss Marple followed the housekeeper through the darkened halls of the manor, each step creaking beneath their feet. The house, which had once been filled with the vibrancy of Farlow's art collection, now seemed empty, cold, almost eerie. Mrs. Gibbons led her into the study, where Farlow had spent most of his time. The room was neatly arranged, with shelves full of books and paintings stacked against the walls. A large desk sat in the center of the room, papers neatly piled on one side. But it was the corner of the room that caught Miss Marple's attention. A small, locked cabinet stood against the wall, its surface slightly scuffed from years of use. Mrs. Gibbons, who had not noticed Miss Marple's keen interest, continued to chatter about the house's upkeep. But Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere, focused on that locked cabinet. She asked Mrs. Gibbons if she could take a look inside the cabinet, and after a moment's hesitation, the housekeeper reluctantly agreed. Miss Marple's heart quickened as she slowly turned the key in the lock. What could be inside? The cabinet creaked open, and there, among various papers and books, was something that made Miss Marple's pulse race, a small, leather-bound journal. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. It was clearly old, its pages yellowed with age, and it looked like something that had been hidden away for a long time. Mrs. Gibbons looked on, wide-eyed, but Miss Marple, ever calm and collected, offered a reassuring smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Gibbons. I believe I've found something that may shed light on the mystery." As she held the journal in her hands, Miss Marple knew that the game had changed. The portrait, the secret conversations, the locked cabinet, everything was starting to come together. She could feel it in her bones. The truth was closer than ever, and the next piece of the puzzle was about to fall into place. The leather-bound journal felt surprisingly heavy in Miss Marple's hands, its texture smooth and worn in all the right places, as though it had been held by many hands over the years. She had long learned that the smallest details, the forgotten corners of a house, the dust on an old book, the wear on a piece of furniture, often told more about a person's life than the obvious things people chose to reveal. She sat down at the desk, setting the journal carefully before her, the faint scent of old paper wafting up as she turned the cover. Mrs. Gibbons had retreated to another room to tend to her duties, and Miss Marple now found herself alone with the journal, a treasure trove of potential secrets. The first few pages were filled with neat handwriting, the ink slightly faded but still legible. It was clearly Mr. Farlow's own hand, and Miss Marple's eyes scanned the entries slowly, savoring each word. The writing began innocuously enough, documenting what appeared to be an ordinary record of Farlow's daily activities. But as Miss Marple turned the pages, her heart began to quicken. Farlow had been more than an art dealer. His journal hinted at a life far more complicated than his quiet, reclusive nature had suggested. There were references to obscure auctions, to purchases of paintings that were thought lost, and mentions of transactions made with strange, secretive figures from distant parts of Europe. But one particular entry caught Miss Marple's eye, a passage that made her breath catch in her throat. "The woman in the portrait. I cannot escape her gaze. I fear that she is the key to everything. I must be careful, for there are those who would kill for her. I am already too far in, but I cannot stop now. The truth must be uncovered, no matter the cost." The words sent a ripple of unease through Miss Marple, but at the same time, they brought a sense of clarity. Mr. Farlow had known something that had made him feel trapped, cornered, even desperate. And whatever it was, it had to do with the portrait. But what was it about the woman in the painting that had driven Farlow to write such a cryptic warning? Miss Marple continued to read, the journal revealing more about Farlow's obsession with the portrait. There were numerous mentions of a long-hidden secret, one that Farlow had discovered about the woman depicted in the painting. Miss Marple's fingers hovered over the page as she read the final lines. "I have learned too much. I will make arrangements for the portrait to be sold to Gregory Knight. I do not trust him, but he is the only one who might understand what has been revealed. The woman in the painting, she is not who she appears to be. She is the key, and I am certain that someone is watching me. They will stop at nothing to ensure the truth remains hidden." Miss Marple's heart raced. Gregory Knight, the name rang a bell. She had heard of him, an art collector of considerable repute, known for his secretive dealings and his ability to procure the rarest of paintings. But who was this woman in the portrait, and why had Farlow been so desperate to conceal her true identity? As Miss Marple sat there, contemplating these new revelations, she heard a soft knock at the door. She quickly closed the journal, tucking it under her shawl, and made her way to answer it. Standing in the doorway was none other than Margaret Gillett, the woman Miss Marple had been observing earlier in the market. She was dressed in dark, somber clothes, her face pale as though she had not slept for several nights. "Miss Marple," Margaret said, her voice measured and controlled, though there was an underlying tension in it. "I was wondering if I might have a word with you." Miss Marple regarded her for a moment, then nodded politely. "Of course, Miss Gillett. Do come in." Margaret stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. She seemed out of place here, as if the very quiet of Miss Marple's cottage unnerved her. "I'm sure you are aware of the tragic events surrounding Mr. Farlow's death," Margaret began, her voice tight. "And I know that you are, shall we say, interested in what happened." She paused, her gaze lingering on Miss Marple. "I've heard that you've been asking around, speaking to people." Miss Marple, as always, maintained her calm demeanor. "I merely do what any concerned citizen might do, Miss Gillett. After all, the circumstances surrounding Mr. Farlow's death were most unusual. There is much that remains unexplained." Margaret looked down, her fingers nervously twisting the hem of her coat. "Yes," she said quietly, "I suppose there is. You see, Miss Marple, I knew Mr. Farlow. I knew him better than most. We had a history together. A long one. I was the one who introduced him to the portrait." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. "You were the one who introduced him to the portrait," she repeated, her voice soft, almost disbelieving. "But why? And what exactly was the nature of your relationship with him?" Margaret hesitated, her eyes darting around the room, as though seeking an escape. "It's complicated," she murmured. "Mr. Farlow and we had an agreement. He wanted the portrait for reasons that had nothing to do with art. He needed it for his research, for his past. And I needed him. I needed him to help me understand something." "What do you mean?" Miss Marple asked, her voice as calm as ever, but her curiosity piqued. Margaret took a deep breath, clearly torn between wanting to reveal everything and keeping her silence. "The woman in the portrait," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She is not just any noblewoman. She is a key figure from Mr. Farlow's youth. Someone he knew long ago. Someone who disappeared, leaving behind only rumors and a trail of mystery. I don't know everything. Mr. Farlow kept many secrets, but I believe the painting holds the answers to what really happened to her." Miss Marple's mind raced, her thoughts aligning with the cryptic entries she had read in the journal. The woman in the portrait was connected to Farlow's past, his deep, hidden past. But how? And why had Farlow gone to such lengths to conceal the truth? "I believe Mr. Farlow knew more than he was willing to admit," Margaret continued, her voice trembling. "And I think he was trying to protect someone, perhaps even himself. But someone didn't want that secret to come to light. And I believe that's why he died." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "And who, Miss Gillett, would want that secret hidden?" Margaret hesitated, her face pale. She seemed to struggle with her words, but finally she spoke. "I'm not sure, Miss Marple, but I suspect that the person who is responsible for Mr. Farlow's death is someone very close to him. Someone who had more to gain from the portrait being destroyed than anyone else." Miss Marple's mind whirled. There were too many secrets, too many unanswered questions. But now, at least, she had a direction, a sense that the portrait, its true history, and the woman in it held the key to unlocking the mystery of Farlow's death. "You've given me much to think about, Miss Gillett," Miss Marple said softly. "And I do believe that I have a clearer understanding of the situation now. Rest assured, I will do my utmost to uncover the truth." Margaret nodded, though she looked far from reassured. She stood up, her gaze lingering on Miss Marple for a moment longer before she turned and walked out of the cottage, leaving behind a trail of uncertainty in her wake. Miss Marple stood in the quiet of the room, the journal now clutched tightly in her hands. The portrait was not just a piece of art, it was a puzzle, a riddle wrapped in secrecy, and it was time for the final pieces to fall into place. The evening was beginning to settle over St. Mary Mead, and the village was bathed in the soft glow of twilight. Miss Marple sat by her fireplace, the crackling of the wood the only sound in the otherwise still cottage. The journal lay before her on the table, open to the page where she had stopped reading earlier, but her thoughts were far from the text. They circled instead around the new revelation Margaret Gillett had offered. The woman in the portrait, it seemed, was not just a forgotten relic of history. She was a person from Mr. Farlow's past, someone whose disappearance had haunted him. Margaret had hinted that Farlow had not been merely an art dealer, but a man caught in a deeper, darker mystery, one tied to the secrets of the past. And someone had wanted those secrets buried. But the most troubling part of Margaret's confession had been the implication that Farlow's death was no accident. Someone close to him, someone who stood to gain from the portrait being hidden, had taken his life. But who could this person be? And why had they wanted to silence Farlow? As Miss Marple mulled over these thoughts, the door to her cottage opened with a soft creak, and in stepped the village's constable, young Mr. Hargreaves. "Good evening, Miss Marple," he said, his face flushed from the cold, his breath coming in short bursts. He held his hat in his hands, looking slightly nervous as he entered the room. "Good evening, Mr. Hargreaves," Miss Marple said, setting the journal aside. "What brings you to my humble abode this evening?" "I've just come from the police station, Miss Marple," Mr. Hargreaves began, his voice low. And I thought you should know, there's been a bit of trouble. Some new information has come to light regarding Mr. Farlow's death." Miss Marple's interest was instantly piqued. "New information, you say? I do believe I'm listening, Mr. Hargreaves." The young constable hesitated, as though unsure of how much he should reveal. "Well, you see, we've had another visit from Mr. Farlow's solicitor, Mr. Ellsworth. He was the one who had Mr. Farlow's affairs in order, and it seems there's been some confusion over the will. The solicitor says there are some unusual instructions about the portrait and certain financial dealings that were never disclosed to the public. He believes Farlow was trying to make arrangements before his death, but the details of those arrangements are unclear." Miss Marple's brow furrowed. "Unclear arrangements? How strange." "It gets stranger, Miss Marple," Mr. Hargreaves continued. "You see, one of Mr. Farlow's closest associates was a man named Alfred Lacey. He was a colleague of Mr. Farlow's in his earlier years, and they worked together on several art deals. Lacey disappeared about 5 years ago, and no one's heard from him since. But we've learned that Lacey had a particular interest in the portrait." Miss Marple's interest deepened further. Alfred Lacey, a name she hadn't heard before. A missing person with a connection to the portrait? She felt the weight of the mystery pressing in on her more than ever. Mr. Lacey had been in and out of Europe for a few years, involved in various, shall we say, questionable transactions, Hargreaves said. But no one knew about his connection to the portrait. It seems that Farlow had been in contact with Lacey recently, and now we're wondering if Lacey might have returned to claim the portrait for himself. "So, you're saying that Mr. Lacey may have returned to the village and, perhaps, had a hand in Mr. Farlow's death?" Miss Marple asked, her voice steady but filled with the quiet intensity of someone who had just uncovered a crucial clue. "I don't know, Miss Marple," Hargreaves replied, his voice uncertain. "But there's something odd going on, and I think Mr. Ellsworth is hiding something. He's been very tight-lipped about the specifics of the will and Farlow's final dealings." Miss Marple said thoughtfully, her eyes narrowing slightly. "So, we have a missing man, a reclusive art dealer, a mysterious portrait, and a solicitor who seems to know more than he lets on. All these pieces, Mr. Hargreaves, and yet something doesn't quite fit. Why would Mr. Farlow, a man who had no known family, leave such specific instructions about a painting? Why would he go to such lengths to conceal its true value? And why would someone as wealthy and knowledgeable as Mr. Farlow be so fearful of the truth coming to light?" Mr. Hargreaves shifted uneasily, clearly feeling the weight of Miss Marple's quiet scrutiny. "I don't know, Miss Marple, but I thought you should know. Perhaps you might be able to shed some light on it. There's something I didn't mention before. The solicitor mentioned that Mr. Farlow had been acting odd in the weeks leading up to his death. He'd become increasingly paranoid, locking his study, refusing visitors, and constantly looking over his shoulder." Miss Marple's mind raced. Edward Farlow's paranoia. The portrait. The strange connections with Alfred Lacey and the mysterious dealings Farlow had been involved in. It was as though Miss Marple was piecing together a puzzle with a few key pieces missing, yet she was getting closer. "Thank you, Mr. Hargreaves," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but resolute. "You've given me much to think about. I believe it's time I spoke with Mr. Ellsworth again." The constable nodded, still looking uneasy. "I'll be around, Miss Marple, if you need anything." After he left, Miss Marple sat for a long while, her fingers lightly tapping on the arm of her chair as she thought over the latest developments. The connection between the portrait, Farlow's death, and the mysterious Alfred Lacey was becoming clearer by the minute. But there were still so many questions, so many hidden truths, that needed to be uncovered. She knew that she would have to be careful. The pieces were slowly falling into place, but she could sense that there were others out there, others who were equally determined to keep the truth hidden. And it was those people, she realized, that she would need to uncover if she were ever to truly understand what had happened to Edward Farlow. The night was growing colder, and Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of a mystery slowly revealing itself. She had always known that the key to solving any puzzle lay in understanding the human heart, the fears, the lies, the hidden desires. She would need to dig deeper into Farlow's past, speak with the people he had known, and learn what had truly been at stake when he brought that portrait into his life. Tomorrow, Miss Marple thought as she stood and stretched, she would pay another visit to the manor. There was still so much to uncover. The days following Miss Marple's quiet conversation with Mr. Hargreaves left her with a growing sense of unease. The pieces of the puzzle were certainly falling into place, but she could not shake the feeling that there was something, some crucial detail, still hidden in the shadows. Farlow's death was no longer just a natural event. It was part of something far larger, something deeply entwined with his past, and the portrait that had both obsessed and terrified him. The village continued with its usual rhythm, the shopkeepers haggling over the prices of vegetables and the children playing in the streets, blissfully unaware of the storm that Miss Marple had already started to uncover. But for Miss Marple, the clock was ticking. Every new discovery, every new thread, led her closer to the truth, but it also made her feel as though the walls were closing in. It was on the fourth evening since her last conversation with Mr. Hargreaves that Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. The knock on her door was light, but firm, and she opened it to find none other than Mrs. Gibbons, the housekeeper from Mr. Farlow's manor. Her face, usually composed and proper, was now pale with worry. She stepped inside quickly, as though afraid someone might see her, and closed the door behind her with unusual urgency. "Good evening, Mrs. Gibbons," Miss Marple said, offering her usual welcoming smile, though she could tell that the housekeeper was on edge. "What brings you to me at this hour?" Mrs. Gibbons looked around the room cautiously, her eyes darting to the windows, as though ensuring they were alone. When she spoke, her voice trembled. "Miss Marple, I don't know where else to turn. I'm so frightened. I think there's something terribly wrong." Miss Marple, ever the patient listener, gestured for her to sit. "Please, do calm yourself, Mrs. Gibbons. What has happened?" The housekeeper hesitated, her hands wringing in her lap. "It's Mr. Farlow's death. I didn't want to believe it, but I think I know who did it. And I think they might be coming after me too." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. "Who, Mrs. Gibbons? Please, tell me what you know." Mrs. Gibbons swallowed hard, then lowered her voice, as though afraid even the walls might listen. "It was Margaret Gillett. I'm sure of it. I've been with Mr. Farlow for over 10 years, Miss Marple. I know when something isn't right. I overheard her speaking to Mr. Farlow just days before his death. I didn't mean to listen, but I couldn't help myself. She was demanding that he sell her the portrait. She wanted it more than anything." Miss Marple leaned forward, her gaze sharp. "You're certain of this?" "Yes, Miss Marple," Mrs. Gibbons said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I heard something else too. I heard Mr. Farlow telling her that he couldn't sell it to her. He said there were complications. That the portrait was linked to something he couldn't explain, something from his past." Margaret was furious. She shouted at him. She said he was being foolish, that he had no right to keep it hidden. And then she left, but she promised him that she would get what she wanted, one way or another. Miss Marple's mind raced. Margaret Gillett, the striking woman who had already piqued her curiosity, was more involved than Miss Marple had suspected. And now, the pieces seemed to fall into place. Farlow's refusal to sell the portrait, Margaret's intense desire for it, and the connections to a dark secret from Farlow's past. But what had happened between them? What had Farlow hidden, and why was Margaret so desperate to possess the portrait? "Mrs. Gibbons, you are quite certain of this?" Miss Marple asked again, her tone gentle but firm. "You heard her threaten him?" Mrs. Gibbons nodded. "Yes, Miss Marple. I did. And after that, Mr. Farlow was never the same. He locked himself in his study, became even more secretive than usual, and he looked over his shoulder as though someone were watching him. I thought he was just being paranoid, but now I realize he was terrified." A chill ran down Miss Marple's spine. Farlow had known something so dangerous that it had driven him to lock himself away. But what? And who was watching him? Was it just Margaret, or was there someone else involved? Miss Marple stood up, her mind already working through the details. "Thank you, Mrs. Gibbons. You've given me much to consider. But I must ask, did Margaret ever mention anything about Alfred Lacey? Or about the past that Mr. Farlow was trying to conceal?" Mrs. Gibbons shook her head, her face pale. "No, Miss Marple. But I've heard rumors about Mr. Lacey, that he was involved in something terrible, something that Farlow had been running from for years. I don't know what it is, but I suspect that the portrait is tied to it somehow. Mr. Farlow's obsession with it, his need to keep it hidden. It was as though he was trying to bury something, and that portrait was the last piece of it. Miss Marple's thoughts were a whirl of connections, suspicions, and potential leads. She knew now that Margaret Gillett was more than just a woman with a keen interest in art. She was deeply entangled in something far more dangerous, and Mr. Farlow had known it. The portrait was the key to everything, and Miss Marple was now more certain than ever that the truth was just within reach. "Mrs. Gibbons, I need you to do something for me," Miss Marple said, her voice steady with purpose. "Please go to your room and rest. Tomorrow, I will visit the manor again. I have a feeling that the next step in this investigation will take us much closer to the truth. You have helped me more than you know." Mrs. Gibbons nodded, though her expression remained clouded with worry. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I don't know what I would have done without your help." After Mrs. Gibbons left, Miss Marple sat in silence for a long time, staring into the fire. The puzzle was nearly complete, but there was still one thing she needed to uncover. She had to speak with Margaret Gillett again. It was clear now that Margaret's motives were far from simple, and her connection to Farlow's death, direct or indirect, was deeper than Miss Marple had initially suspected. Tomorrow would be the day she would confront Margaret. Miss Marple's quiet confidence had always been her greatest strength, and she knew that with one final conversation, she would unlock the truth behind Mr. Farlow's death, and the tragic mystery of the woman in the portrait. The morning broke over St. Mary Mead with the kind of quiet stillness that Miss Marple had come to expect in her long years of observing human nature. The sun filtered gently through the lace curtains of her cottage, and the birds outside sang with an unhurried rhythm that matched her own sense of anticipation. She had always preferred to let things unfold naturally, and today was no different. But today, she had a particular task ahead of her. She was going to confront Margaret Gillett, and she knew that this would be the key moment in unraveling the mystery that had taken root in the village like a poisonous vine. The portrait, the hidden truths of Mr. Farlow's past, and the whispers about Alfred Lacey, all these threads were now beginning to weave together. And Miss Marple was determined to pull them all into the light. Miss Marple had already made her preparations. She had a few quiet words with the local constable, Mr. Hargreaves, whom she trusted to provide subtle assistance when the time was right. She also took the precaution of leaving a small note with Mrs. Gibbons at the manor, just in case things took a turn that would require her to act quickly. It was clear to Miss Marple that Margaret Gillett was not the sort to give up her secrets easily, and the woman's desperation to possess the portrait spoke volumes about the importance of what it hid. The meeting with Margaret would be carefully staged. Miss Marple, ever the subtle strategist, would offer her a chance to confess, but only if Margaret were pushed into a corner, if she felt that there was no other option. It was a psychological trap, the kind that Miss Marple had used successfully in the past, and she was certain that it would work again now. As the day wore on, Miss Marple made her way to Margaret Gillett's home, a well-maintained cottage at the far end of the village. The house was surrounded by tall hedges, and the garden, though charming, had an almost aloof air to it, impeccably arranged, but lacking the warmth that often characterized the homes of St. Mary Mead's villagers. Miss Marple paused at the gate, taking in the scene. She could almost feel the weight of the secrecy that clung to this house, and for a brief moment, she was reminded of the art galleries she had visited as a young woman, where every painting seemed to hide 1,000 emotions beneath its still surface. When she knocked on the door, it opened almost immediately. Margaret stood before her, dressed in a neat, practical dress of deep blue. Her eyes, however, were wary. No doubt she had heard the rumors swirling around the village, and Miss Marple's reputation for solving mysteries preceded her. "Miss Marple," Margaret said, her voice cool but polite. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I hope I'm not disturbing you," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle yet firm. "I simply wanted to have a conversation. There are some matters regarding Mr. Farlow's death that I think you can help clarify." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, but she stepped aside to allow Miss Marple entry. The interior of the cottage was immaculate, its walls adorned with art, some modern, some classical. The portraits, many of them landscapes, seemed to crowd the space, but none of them seemed to have the same presence as the one Miss Marple had seen at Mr. Farlow's manor. They sat in a cozy parlor, and Miss Marple allowed Margaret to offer her tea, though she could tell from the set of Margaret's shoulders that the woman was on edge. "I'm sure you're aware, Miss Marple, that I've no interest in rehashing Mr. Farlow's death," Margaret said, her voice stiff. The police have concluded their investigation, and I trust that will be the end of it." "Of course," Miss Marple replied, her voice as soft and unassuming as ever. "But you see, I believe there are still some loose ends that need tying up. Mr. Farlow, as you know, was not a man who shared much of himself with others. And yet, in the days leading up to his death, he seemed to be increasingly distressed. I wonder, Miss Gillett, if you can tell me why." Margaret shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her fingers tightening around her teacup. "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple." Mr. Farlow had always been a man of mystery. He kept to himself. It's hardly surprising that he became a bit reclusive before his death. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her eyes keen and steady. "Ah, but there was something more than that, wasn't there? You see, I've spoken with Mrs. Gibbons. She overheard a conversation between you and Mr. Farlow before his death, one in which you demanded he sell you the portrait, despite his refusal. You were quite insistent, I believe." Margaret's face stiffened. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, with a slight edge to her voice, she replied, "I don't know what Mrs. Gibbons heard, but I can assure you that she is mistaken. I had no such conversation with Mr. Farlow." "Is that so?" Miss Marple asked, her voice light but probing. "And yet, I hear you spoke to him about the portrait. And more importantly, I hear you spoke of it with urgency. Why the urgency, Miss Gillett? Why did you want that particular portrait so badly?" Margaret's eyes flickered briefly, and for just a moment, Miss Marple saw something, an emotion, fleeting but real, that suggested the woman was not being entirely truthful. A crack in her calm exterior. "It's just an old painting," Margaret said, forcing a smile. "Nothing more than a piece of art. I've always had an interest in the history of art, and Mr. Farlow had an impressive collection. There was no harm in wanting to add one more piece." Miss Marple was unmoved. "That may be true, Miss Gillett, but I wonder if there's more to it than that. You see, I've learned that the portrait is not just a painting. It is a connection to Mr. Farlow's past, a past that I suspect was tied to the disappearance of Alfred Lacey, the man who had been so closely involved with him." Margaret stiffened, her gaze dropping for a brief moment. The shift in her expression was subtle, but to Miss Marple's trained eyes, it was telling. She had touched a nerve. "You don't know what you're talking about," Margaret snapped, her voice suddenly sharp, her composure cracking. "Alfred Lacey was nothing to Mr. Farlow. He was just a passing acquaintance. A mistake from the past that should have been left buried." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, but there was a firmness to it now. "And yet you're the one who's so desperate to possess the portrait, Miss Gillett. Why? What is it about this portrait that you're willing to go to such lengths to acquire it? What is the secret that Mr. Farlow was trying to protect?" Margaret stood up abruptly, her chair scraping across the floor. "I don't have time for this, Miss Marple," she said, her voice taut with barely contained anger. "You're wrong. You have no idea what you're talking about." Miss Marple remained seated, her posture relaxed but her eyes unwavering. "I think, Miss Gillett, that you are hiding something. I think you know exactly what I'm talking about. And I think you're trying to protect someone, or something, that has more to do with that portrait than you're willing to admit." For a long moment, the room was silent. Margaret stood there, her fists clenched at her sides, her eyes dark with something that Miss Marple could not quite place. Fear, guilt, or perhaps both. Finally, Margaret spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're right. There's more to it. But I can't tell you everything. Not yet." Miss Marple's heart raced. This was it. The trap had worked. Margaret had been cornered, and the truth was now within her grasp. "Then, Miss Gillett," Miss Marple said softly, "perhaps it's time you tell me everything." The silence in the small parlor hung heavily between them, the tension palpable in the air as Margaret Gillett stood before Miss Marple, her posture rigid and her face a mask of defiance and fear. The teacup in her hands trembled slightly, though she made no effort to steady it. Miss Marple, ever patient and unhurried, allowed the quiet to stretch on for several moments. She knew that Margaret was at a crossroads, caught between the impulse to reveal everything and the fear of what might happen if she did. The truth, Miss Marple was certain, was on the verge of spilling out. There was no longer any way to avoid it. Margaret took a deep breath, and for the first time, her gaze softened. She slowly set the teacup down, the faint clink of china filling the silence before she spoke. "You're right," Margaret began, her voice low and strained. "There is more to it. Far more than I wanted to admit." She paused, as though gathering her thoughts, then continued, "The portrait, it's not just any painting. It's tied to Mr. Farlow's past, to a time he tried to bury, a time he wanted to forget." Miss Marple's eyes never wavered, her expression one of gentle encouragement. She could see that Margaret was struggling with the weight of the secret, but Miss Marple knew that once the floodgates were open, the woman would no longer be able to hold it back. Margaret swallowed hard. Alfred Lacey. He wasn't just some passing acquaintance. He was a part of something darker, something Mr. Farlow and well, we were both involved in. But Lacey knew things, dangerous things, things I should have never learned. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her gaze sharp. "Go on, Miss Gillett. What things did Lacey know?" Margaret's face twisted with a mixture of regret and fear. Alfred Lacey was more than just an art dealer. He was a part of a network, a group that trafficked in stolen art, yes, but also in information, in secrets. Mr. Farlow and I were involved with them for a time, though I didn't know the full extent of it then. We, Mr. Farlow and I, worked with Lacey to uncover rare and valuable works of art. But it wasn't just for money or prestige. There was something more to it. Something dangerous. Miss Marple's mind raced as she pieced the story together. The missing pieces were finally falling into place. The portrait, the one that had fascinated and terrified Farlow, was not just an ordinary painting. It was a key to something darker, something that had tied Farlow to a past he had tried to escape. But what was it? Mr. Farlow wanted to leave that life behind, Margaret continued, her voice growing quieter. But there was one painting, one portrait, that he couldn't escape. It had been part of Lacey's collection, and it had a history, an old and dangerous one. The woman in the portrait was not just a noblewoman. She was someone involved in the same web of secrets, and her connection to Lacey and Mr. Farlow went far deeper than anyone knew. Miss Marple remained silent, waiting for the woman to reveal the rest. She could feel the weight of the moment, the quiet tension that told her the truth was just on the edge of being exposed. Margaret's hands clenched into fists at her sides. The portrait was of a woman named Lydia Lacey, Alfred Lacey's sister. She had been part of the same network, but she disappeared years ago. No one knew what happened to her, but there were rumors that she had been involved in some sort of betrayal, something that made her disappear without a trace. I think Mr. Farlow knew the truth, but he refused to share it with anyone. He thought that if he kept the portrait, he could somehow keep Lydia's memory alive and hidden, away from the people who wanted to find it. Miss Marple's heart quickened. The pieces were fitting together with painful clarity. The portrait was not just a work of art, it was a symbol of a buried secret, a secret that had haunted Farlow for years, and now it seemed it had claimed his life. So, Mr. Farlow was trying to protect Lydia Lacey's memory? Miss Marple asked gently. "And you, Miss Gillett, you wanted the portrait for what reason?" Margaret's gaze dropped to the floor, and for the first time, she seemed truly vulnerable. "I thought that if I had the portrait, I could understand what happened. I thought it would tell me what Mr. Farlow had been hiding all these years. I thought that maybe it would give me some power, some connection to a past that I had lost." She looked up at Miss Marple, her eyes filled with a quiet, tortured realization. "But I was wrong. The truth wasn't something that could be controlled. And now, I've done more harm than good." Miss Marple's voice softened, though there was an undeniable firmness to it. "It's never too late to make things right, Miss Gillett. But first, you must face the truth. The portrait, you see, holds more than just memories. It's the key to understanding Mr. Farlow's death. But someone wanted it badly enough to kill for it. It wasn't just a matter of money or art. It was about protecting something far darker. And I believe that the person who killed Mr. Farlow is someone you know." Margaret's face went pale, and she recoiled slightly. "You don't mean, it wasn't me, Miss Marple? I didn't—" "No, it was not you, Miss Gillett," Miss Marple interrupted, her voice calm yet resolute. "But I believe you know the one who did." For a long moment, Margaret said nothing, but the guilt in her eyes was unmistakable. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Alfred Lacey. He never truly left St. Mary Mead. He was here, watching Farlow, waiting for the right moment to strike. Miss Marple's heart pounded. Lacey. But he disappeared 5 years ago. Margaret nodded, her face pale. He was here, in the village, under another name. And when Mr. Farlow refused to sell the portrait, when he became too scared to keep it any longer, Lacey returned to reclaim it. I think he killed Farlow to keep the secret buried. But Lacey didn't realize that the portrait wasn't just a painting. It was a symbol of something much darker. Something that would cost him his life. Miss Marple stood up slowly, her expression one of quiet resolution. The truth, Miss Gillett, is that Mr. Farlow's death was not about a painting. It was about the secrets of the past. Secrets that have now come to light. And it is time for them to be revealed. With that, Miss Marple left Margaret Gillett's cottage, her mind already moving ahead, knowing that the final pieces of the puzzle were finally in place. The mystery of the portrait, of Lydia Lacey, and of Alfred Lacey's long-hidden presence in St. Mary Mead was nearly solved. But the last step, the final confrontation, would come soon. And Miss Marple knew that once the truth was revealed, there would be no going back. The streets of St. Mary Mead were unusually quiet as Miss Marple walked back to her cottage after her meeting with Margaret Gillett. The weight of the new information hung heavily in her mind, but there was also a growing sense of clarity. She had known, from the very first moment Mr. Farlow had collapsed at the fate, that the truth was not something that could be easily brushed aside. It was always in the details, in the quiet, unnoticed moments, that the real story emerged. Now, with the final pieces of the puzzle falling into place, Miss Marple was more certain than ever that the mystery was nearing its conclusion. But there was one more step to take. The final confrontation with Alfred Lacey, or rather, with the man who had assumed the identity of Alfred Lacey in the village, was inevitable. As Miss Marple approached her cottage, she could see that the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a soft, golden light over the village. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and the faintest hint of wood smoke. It was the kind of evening that invited reflection, a time for settling the mind after a long day. Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that her years of observation, of carefully considering every detail, had brought her to this moment. She entered her cottage and sat by the fire, her knitting still in her lap. But instead of picking up her work, she leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes, allowing herself a brief moment of stillness. There was much to consider, and the final pieces of the story were already beginning to play out in her mind. The portrait. The woman in the painting had been at the center of it all, a symbol of something long buried in the past, something that had driven Edward Farlow to madness and, ultimately, to his death. It wasn't just about art or money. It was about the secrets that had been hidden for so many years, and the lengths to which people would go to protect them. The portrait of Lydia Lacey, the woman whose disappearance had haunted Mr. Farlow for decades, had been a relic of that dark past. But it was more than just a memory. It was the key to understanding the complex web of lies and betrayals that had shaped the lives of everyone involved. And now, it seemed, it was the final piece of the puzzle that had led to murder. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. She rose, her movements slow but deliberate, and opened it to find Mr. Hargreaves, the young constable, standing on the threshold. "Good evening, Miss Marple," he said, his voice tense but polite. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Mr. Hargreaves," Miss Marple replied. Come in, come in. What brings you here this evening?" Mr. Hargreaves stepped inside, his brow furrowed with concern. "I've just come from the manor," he said, his tone serious. "We've got news. It's about Alfred Lacey. I believe we've found him." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat, but she remained composed. "Found him? You mean, he's been hiding here in the village all along?" Mr. Hargreaves nodded grimly. "Yes. We discovered that the man who has been living in the village as Edward Lacey is actually Alfred Lacey, the same man who disappeared 5 years ago. It seems he returned to St. Mary Mead after Mr. Farlow's death, and he had been living under a false name, keeping to himself and avoiding suspicion." Miss Marple's mind raced. The final piece of the puzzle was in place. Alfred Lacey had not just been hiding from the law. He had been hiding the truth about the portrait, about Lydia Lacey, and about what had happened all those years ago. "I see," Miss Marple said quietly. "And where is Mr. Lacey now?" "He's at the manor," Mr. Hargreaves replied. "We've taken him into custody. But Miss Marple, I must warn you, it's not as simple as we thought. He's not the only one involved in this. There's more to the story than we initially realized." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "More, you say?" Mr. Hargreaves hesitated for a moment before speaking again, his voice lower now. "There's another person, someone who's been helping Lacey from the shadows. Someone who's been pulling the strings." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with understanding. "I believe I know who you mean," she said softly. "Margaret Gillett." Hargreaves looked taken aback. "How did you—" "I had my suspicions from the beginning," Miss Marple replied, her voice calm but firm. "Margaret Gillett was involved with Mr. Farlow long before his death. She knew about the portrait and the secrets it held, and she would have done anything to get her hands on it. I believe she worked with Lacey to eliminate Mr. Farlow and take control of the portrait." Mr. Hargreaves nodded slowly. "That's what we've come to suspect as well. But Miss Marple, we can't move forward without evidence. We need to gather everything, make sure we have enough to charge them." Miss Marple stood, her expression thoughtful. "You'll find that the evidence is all around you, Mr. Hargreaves. It's in the way they acted, the things they said, and most importantly, in the portrait itself. Once you understand the connection between the painting and the past, the rest of it will make sense." The constable looked at her, his eyes wide with realization. "You think that the portrait is the key, don't you?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I do. The portrait holds the truth of Mr. Farlow's death. But it's not just about the painting itself, it's about what it represents. The past, the mistakes, the betrayals. And, in the end, it's about the people who will stop at nothing to protect their secrets." There was a long pause, and then Mr. Hargreaves nodded. "You're right, Miss Marple. We'll gather the evidence. I'll go back to the manor and—" "No," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "I will go with you. It's time to finish this, Mr. Hargreaves. It's time to confront the truth." Later that evening, Miss Marple and Mr. Hargreaves made their way to Mr. Farlow's manor. The house, once filled with the quiet hum of life, now stood silent and imposing, its windows dark and still. The final confrontation was near, and Miss Marple could feel the weight of the moment pressing in on her. This was the end of the mystery, the moment when everything would be revealed. As they entered the manor, Miss Marple's eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail. The paintings that lined the walls, the dim light that cast long shadows, the quiet sense of foreboding that lingered in the air. It was all coming to a head now. And then, in the center of the room, she saw him, Alfred Lacey, sitting quietly in a chair, his hands folded in front of him. His face was impassive, but there was something in his eyes that Miss Marple knew all too well. He was guilty, and he knew it. Margaret Gillett was standing nearby, her posture rigid, her face pale. She had known that this moment would come. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice steady and calm. "It's over now, Mr. Lacey. You and Miss Gillett have been hiding the truth for too long. The portrait, the secrets, it's time to face the consequences." Lacey looked up at her, his eyes narrowing. "You think you've won, Miss Marple? You think the truth will save you?" "The truth always comes to light, Mr. Lacey," Miss Marple replied softly. "And today it will be revealed." The air in the grand drawing room of Mr. Farlow's manor was thick with tension. The room, dimly lit by the flickering light of an old chandelier, seemed to press in on Miss Marple and the two culprits who stood before her, Alfred Lacey and Margaret Gillett. The portrait of Lydia Lacey, still hanging on the wall, seemed almost alive, its somber eyes reflecting the weight of the secrets that had lingered in the shadows for so long. Miss Marple had always known that this moment would come. The final confrontation, the unraveling of the mystery that had twisted through the village like an insidious thread, had been a long time in the making. She had seen the signs, heard the whispers, pieced together the fragments of the puzzle. Now, at last, the pieces were falling into place. She stood calmly, her posture impeccable, as though the weight of the situation was nothing more than a quiet challenge. To the casual observer, she might have appeared like the frail, elderly woman she appeared to be, but Miss Marple's mind was as sharp as ever. Her ability to observe, to discern the smallest details, had brought her here, and it would be her keen understanding of human nature that would unravel the final knots in this tangled web. "Mr. Lacey," Miss Marple began, her voice soft but unwavering, "I do believe you've been playing a rather dangerous game, haven't you?" Lacey's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. Margaret Gillett, standing at his side, remained silent as well, though her nervous movements, her fidgeting fingers, her inability to meet Miss Marple's gaze, betrayed the quiet storm inside her. "I believe we have much to discuss, don't we?" Miss Marple continued, her gaze flickering between the two of them. "The portrait, Mr. Lacey, and the secrets you've both worked so hard to keep hidden. You've been very careful, haven't you? But care is a double-edged sword. It always leaves traces. A small thing here, a glance there, a word at the wrong moment. And that, my dear people, is how the truth comes to light." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. The room felt colder now, the shadows stretching across the walls like a tightening noose. "Tell me, Mr. Lacey," Miss Marple continued, her voice gaining strength, "why did you return to St. Mary Mead? After all these years, after vanishing without a trace, what brought you back?" Lacey's lips curled into a tight smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You seem to have pieced everything together, Miss Marple." "Yes, I came back for the portrait. It's the last remaining piece. The key to everything." Miss Marple nodded, as though confirming something she had already known. "The portrait of Lydia Lacey. Your sister. A woman whose disappearance haunted not only you, but Mr. Farlow as well. I believe Mr. Farlow knew the truth, didn't he?" Lacey's smile faltered. "Mr. Farlow knew too much. He was a fool to hold on to that portrait. It was his obsession with it that led to his downfall. He thought he could bury the past, but you can't hide from the truth forever. And when he refused to sell it to me, when he refused to let me take what was mine, that's when I realized I had no choice. He had to die." Margaret Gillett, who had been standing quietly, her hands twisting in front of her, suddenly spoke, her voice trembling. "Alfred, please, it wasn't supposed to happen like this. We just wanted to finish what we started. The portrait was worth so much more than Farlow could understand. We didn't know how far it would go." "Stop!" Lacey barked, his anger flaring for a moment before he quickly regained control. "You have no idea what you're talking about. This was never about money. It was about control. The portrait holds the key to everything. Farlow's involvement with us. It was a transaction of power, of hidden knowledge, and Farlow was too weak to understand it. He could have walked away, but he chose to protect that damned painting instead." Miss Marple's eyes flickered with understanding. "The portrait was a symbol, wasn't it? A symbol of something much darker than mere art. It was about the ties that bound you to Farlow, to the past, to a secret that you both had spent your lives trying to bury. And when Farlow refused to sell it, refused to hand over the key to his own past, that's when you acted, isn't it?" Lacey's expression darkened, but there was a coldness in his eyes that betrayed his attempt to maintain control. He spoke with quiet menace. "You don't know the full story, Miss Marple. But I suppose it doesn't matter now. You've unraveled enough. Yes, I killed Farlow. I had to. He stood in the way of everything." Margaret's voice cracked. "I didn't mean for him to die. I thought if I could just convince him to sell it to me, everything would be fine. But then Farlow started acting strange. Paranoid. And then Alfred came back. And we—" "You knew," Miss Marple interrupted gently, her voice cutting through the tension. "You knew exactly what was going to happen. You were complicit, Miss Gillett. You helped him. You were desperate for the portrait. The power it held. The knowledge that it represented." Margaret turned away, her face pale, as though the weight of her actions was finally dawning on her. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I helped him. I thought that if I could possess it, if I could control it, I could understand everything. I didn't realize what it would cost." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her tone remained firm. "The cost, Miss Gillett, was more than you could ever have imagined. You thought the portrait was a tool, something to unlock power, to give you control. But in the end, it controlled you. And now it's too late." She turned to Mr. Hargreaves, who had been standing quietly in the doorway, waiting for the right moment to act. "It's time, Mr. Hargreaves." At her signal, the constable stepped forward, his hand resting on the handle of the door, ready to summon the officers waiting outside. Lacey and Gillett were trapped now. There was no escape from the truth. The room felt colder still as Miss Marple spoke the final words that would bring the mystery to its conclusion. "Mr. Lacey, Miss Gillett, I believe you both have much to answer for." As the officers moved in to apprehend them, Lacey and Gillett exchanged one final glance, a look that spoke volumes about the past they had tried so hard to bury, the lies they had woven, and the ultimate price they had paid. But in the end, it was the truth that had triumphed, as it always did. The portrait had been the key, the link to everything, and now it was time for St. Mary Mead, and the world, to understand what had really happened. The atmosphere in St. Mary Mead felt different the morning after Alfred Lacey and Margaret Gillett were taken into custody. The mystery that had once cast a shadow over the village was now, finally, unraveling. Yet, there was still something solemn about the air, as if the very ground beneath Miss Marple's feet had shifted. She had solved the puzzle, yes, but the darkness of what had happened, and what had been concealed for so long, left a lingering taste in her mouth. As the days passed, the village resumed its slow, peaceful pace. The usual rhythms of life, tea on the veranda, strolls through the village square, gossip over garden fences, continued as though nothing had happened. But Miss Marple knew better. She had always known that beneath the surface of the village's charm, there were stories waiting to be uncovered, some of which were far darker than others. The investigation into Alfred Lacey and Margaret Gillett had not yet concluded. There would be trials, confessions, and the slow process of justice taking its course. But Miss Marple had already heard enough from the police and the solicitor to know the true story. The portrait of Lydia Lacey had indeed been the key to everything. It had been the symbol of a terrible betrayal, a reminder of a past that had been locked away. Alfred Lacey, desperate to reclaim his family's lost power, had returned to St. Mary Mead, hoping to obtain the portrait and the secrets it concealed. And when Mr. Farlow had refused to hand it over, when he had become a barrier to the past that Lacey and Gillett so desperately wanted to resurrect, the result had been murder. Yet, it was not just about a portrait or a piece of art. It was about the years of guilt and fear that had driven Farlow to hide the painting and the family secrets it represented. It was about Lacey's desire to control the past and rewrite the future. And it was about Margaret Gillett, who had been seduced by the idea of power that the portrait promised, and who had become an unwitting accomplice in a crime that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Miss Marple sat quietly in her cottage that morning, the soft crackling of the fire the only sound in the room. She was staring at the letter that had arrived earlier that day. It was from Mr. Ellsworth, the solicitor who had been representing Mr. Farlow and now dealing with the aftermath of his death. The letter was brief, but it held the final pieces of the puzzle. Miss Marple unfolded the letter and began to read. Asterisk, Dear Miss Marple, I am writing to inform you of the final disposition of Mr. Farlow's estate. After careful review of his will and personal papers, it has become clear that Mr. Farlow had been attempting to right a wrong that was done many years ago. The portrait of Lydia Lacey, which had been locked away for decades, was not just a family heirloom, it was a key to a darker past that he had hoped to keep buried. Mr. Farlow's last wishes were to have the portrait destroyed, but, alas, his untimely death has prevented that. As per the terms of his will, I am requesting your assistance in ensuring that the portrait is placed in the hands of the proper authorities. Its significance cannot be overstated. I trust you will handle this matter with the same care and discretion you have shown throughout this investigation. Yours sincerely, Arthur Ellsworth, asterisk. Miss Marple set the letter down, her hands trembling slightly. She had expected this, of course. Mr. Farlow's desire to see the portrait destroyed was in keeping with his fear of what it represented. The portrait was more than just a painting. It was a reminder of a past that had nearly destroyed him, a past that had come back to claim its due. But Miss Marple also knew that the portrait, as significant as it had been, was no longer the key to the mystery. It was the people involved, Lacey, Gillett, and Farlow himself, that had been the true puzzle all along. The portrait had simply been the final piece that had unlocked the truth. With a sigh, Miss Marple rose from her chair and walked over to the window, looking out over the peaceful village. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the rooftops. For a moment, everything seemed as it should be, quiet, calm, and untroubled. But Miss Marple knew better. She knew that beneath the calm surface of St. Mary Mead, There would always be more mysteries, more secrets waiting to be uncovered. And she would be there, as she always had been, ready to listen, to observe, and to uncover the truth. She turned back to the letter, her mind already moving forward. The portrait would be dealt with, but there was still one last step. She would go to the manor tomorrow, meet with Mr. Ellsworth, and ensure that the painting's final fate was decided. And perhaps, in the process, she would find one final piece of the puzzle, a deeper understanding of the people involved and the lives they had led. The fire in the hearth crackled softly as Miss Marple sat back down, the flickering flames casting shadows on the walls. She was content, for now. The truth had been revealed, and justice would take its course. But there was always more to learn. And for Miss Marple, that was enough. As she sat there, contemplating the long journey of this investigation, she realized that, in the end, it wasn't the painting, or even the people involved, that had intrigued her the most. It was the mystery of human nature itself, the way that even the most seemingly innocent of lives could hide the deepest secrets. And that, she knew, would always be the greatest puzzle of all. The morning after the letter from Mr. Ellsworth had arrived was a crisp, quiet one, with a faint mist hanging in the air, clinging to the rooftops of St. Mary Mead like an old memory. Miss Marple, as always, was up before the sun, her routine steady and unhurried. She had already brewed a pot of tea, the steam rising in delicate tendrils as she sat in her favorite chair by the window, reflecting on the events of the past weeks. The final pieces of the mystery were now firmly in place. Alfred Lacey and Margaret Gillett had been arrested and were facing charges related to Mr. Farlow's death. The portrait of Lydia Lacey, which had played such a central role in the intrigue, was being handled by Mr. Ellsworth's office, who had promised to see it to the proper authorities. But there was one final step, one final conversation to be had before the full weight of the mystery could be put to rest. Miss Marple had made arrangements to meet with Mr. Ellsworth at the manor that afternoon. The solicitor had been instrumental in uncovering the details of Mr. Farlow's will, which had been far more intricate than anyone had initially realized. She knew that the final disposition of the portrait and the estate would be her responsibility in some way, but she also knew that the portrait itself held no more secrets. It had served its purpose, and now it was time to lay the past to rest. The village was beginning to stir as Miss Marple made her way toward the manor. The cobblestones underfoot felt familiar, comforting even, and as she passed the little shops that lined the street, she could hear the cheerful hum of conversation, the clinking of teacups, and the soft rustling of pages as the village carried on with its quiet, everyday life. She arrived at Mr. Farlow's manor just as the sun broke through the mist, casting a golden glow over the ivy-covered stone walls. The house, once so filled with art and mystery, now felt still and empty, as though the weight of its secrets had finally been lifted. Mr. Ellsworth greeted her at the door, his expression one of calm professionalism, though Miss Marple could see the faint lines of worry around his eyes. He had been dealing with the fallout from Mr. Farlow's death for weeks, and the truth had finally come to light. Truths about the portrait, the betrayal, and the lengths to which people would go to protect their pasts. "Miss Marple," Mr. Ellsworth said with a polite bow. "I trust you're well." "Quite well, Mr. Ellsworth," Miss Marple replied with a smile, stepping inside. "I must say, it is a relief to see the matter resolved. But I imagine there is still much to be done." "Yes, indeed," he said, leading her into the drawing room. The air inside the manor was cooler than outside, and the atmosphere felt slightly oppressive, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The portrait of Lydia Lacey, which had once been displayed in the center of the room, was now carefully draped in cloth. The secrets it held now no longer a mystery. "Please have a seat," Mr. Ellsworth said, gesturing to a chair near the fireplace. "We've made the arrangements for the portrait's final disposition. It will be transferred to a secure location for safekeeping, as per Mr. Farlow's wishes. And as for the rest of his estate..." Miss Marple sat down, folding her hands in her lap. "Yes, I understand. I believe I'm to be involved in the final steps, but I must admit, Mr. Ellsworth, that I've learned something over the course of this investigation that has left me rather curious." Mr. Ellsworth raised an eyebrow but said nothing, clearly waiting for Miss Marple to elaborate. "Mr. Farlow's will," she began thoughtfully. "It was not just a simple document, was it? There were conditions, hidden clauses, things that were not immediately apparent." Ellsworth stiffened slightly, but then nodded. "You're correct, Miss Marple. Mr. Farlow had made certain provisions that only became clear after his death. Some of them were unusual, to say the least. But Mr. Farlow's final wishes were clear, and I intend to honor them. Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her tone remained steady. And what of the portrait itself, Mr. Ellsworth? What is to become of it now? Ellsworth hesitated for a moment, his fingers tapping gently on the armrest of his chair. The portrait will be taken to a museum. It will be preserved as a historical artifact. But as for the rest of Mr. Farlow's collection, well, that will be auctioned off. A portion of the proceeds will be given to charity, as he had wished. Miss Marple nodded slowly, considering this. And the portrait of Lydia Lacy? You said it would be transferred for safekeeping. But where will it go? Somewhere safe, Mr. Ellsworth replied carefully. Somewhere where it can no longer cause harm. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, a small sigh escaping her lips. She had always known that the portrait held a significance that transcended its mere value as a piece of art. It had been a symbol of guilt, of betrayal, and of a dark past that had haunted Mr. Farlow and, indeed, the whole village. But now, its purpose was complete. The secrets had been revealed, and those who had sought to hide the truth had been exposed. I believe, Miss Marple said, her voice soft but firm, that the time has come to put the past to rest. Mr. Farlow's death was a tragedy, but it was also the culmination of years of fear and secrecy. It is not the portrait that should be remembered, but the people who were caught in its web. Ellsworth nodded, his expression thoughtful. Yes, I suppose you're right. But what of Lacy and Gillett? They will face the consequences of their actions, won't they? They will, Miss Marple said. But the truth, in the end, is what matters most. Once the truth is known, it can never be hidden again. Lacy and Gillett will have to live with their choices, just as Mr. Farlow had to live with his. Miss Marple stood, her movements slow and deliberate. I believe, Mr. Ellsworth, that we are done here. The portrait will be dealt with, the estate settled, and the secrets of the past laid to rest. But remember, it is not the objects we inherit that define us. It is the choices we make, the lives we live, and the truths we are willing to face. Mr. Ellsworth stood as well, offering a polite nod. Thank you, Miss Marple. You've been invaluable throughout this process. Miss Marple smiled, though her eyes were thoughtful. It was my pleasure, Mr. Ellsworth, and I trust that, in the future, you'll be more careful about what secrets you allow into your collection. With that, Miss Marple made her way out of the manor, the door closing behind her with a quiet click. The village, bathed in the soft light of dusk, seemed unchanged. The rhythm of life would continue, as it always had. But Miss Marple knew, as she walked down the familiar path, that this chapter of St. Mary Mead's history had come to a close. The portrait of Lydia Lacy, the key to a dark past, had been dealt with. The truth had been revealed. And for Miss Marple, that was all that mattered.